Last year I reviewed Gigabyte's Aero 15X9 laptop, and while it was perfectly decent, my advice to you was to wait with your buying decision. I was confident we'd be looking at a refresh of that laptop very soon after my original review. This Gigabyte Aorus 15G is, as far as I'm concerned, the refresh of that laptop. However, it is much more than a refresh. So yes, the processor goes from 9th gen to 10th gen. The graphics are Nvidia RTX 2070 still, however they've become super. We've got dual channel memory, the SSD has changed, the screen has changed, this is a 240Hz panel, and the keyboard has changed. It's a mechanical keyboard, and also at least one of the ports and connectors has changed. It's a refresh, but it's one heck of a big refresh. If you like this video, hit subscribe. If you love it, hit the bell button. Gigabyte tells us they've made a major change inside the laptop chassis, and they've introduced a cooling system called WindForce Infinity, which is certainly a grand name. So I'm going to take a look at that, and that means I need my trusty T6 Torx driver. Inside the chassis, the new 15G bears a striking resemblance to the previous X9. It is also crystal clear the cooler has changed quite significantly. These fans look much larger, and there are extra heat pipes. I'm counting 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. However, Gigabyte's diagram tells us there's a 5th heat pipe under there. I may not be bowled over by the WindForce Infinity name, but the cooling system has certainly been enhanced. Putting the two laptops side by side is a bit of an eye-opener. Moving away from the cooling system, CPU and GPU, we have the memory modules. That's two 8GB modules, 3200 MHz in dual channel. Chipset for the motherboard under there. Here we have a 512GB SSD and another slot over here if you want to add more storage. Wi-Fi is killer 1650X, which means Wi-Fi 6. That, curiously, is powered by Intel. Battery is unchanged, 6200 mAh, 94.24 watt hours. Inside the chassis, the cooling system is denser, I suppose, but the other components are all familiar. Let's take a look at the ports and connectors on the laptop, which are on the two sides, with nothing on the back and nothing on the front. On the right hand side, we have the power jack, SD card slot, a USB Type-C Thunderbolt, and a pair of Type-A's. They are USB 3.2 Gen 1. On the left hand side, HDMI 2.0, mini DisplayPort 1.4, a third USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-A, audio headset jack, and there is killer Ethernet. When it comes to the grills and the vents on the laptop, Gigabyte talks about the nods to racing cars and such like. I don't go along with that. I think it looks perfectly okay, but they are really pleased with what they've achieved here. Me, not so much. The Full HD screen is interesting because it's rated at 240Hz. As a point of even greater interest, Gigabyte tells us they might have a shortage of supply. They seem a little bit unclear. In the event you order a 240Hz SKU of this laptop and they can't supply a laptop with that panel, you get a 300Hz version instead, which sounds pretty decent to me. Having said all of that, the screen looks okay. The viewing angle is all right. The colours are perfectly decent. So I think we can agree this 240Hz or 300Hz feature is squarely aimed at the gamers among us. There is no doubt whatsoever that 240Hz is a major step forward from the more usual 120Hz or possibly 144Hz. 300Hz, that's an enormous figure for a laptop panel. A major feature of the Aorus 15G is the mechanical keyboard, which doesn't really look like a mechanical keyboard. The keys look quite conventional. We've seen mechanical keyboards in the past on things like MSI Titans. They're huge, great things. They're regular keyboards, desktop keyboards. This is nothing of the sort. The switches are Omron and they have a 2.5mm travel, but the actuation points, I think they say 1.6mm, i.e. not very much. Funnily enough, the most significant point about the keyboard is not the fact it has mechanical switches, it's the layout. The layout feels a bit odd because there's no separation between the numpad and the keyboard, and as a consequence you have to get used to it, but it is a good keyboard to type on. Clearly you have a question with mechanical keyboards. How noisy are they? Not especially so, but that's not really very scientific, is it? Let's bring in this Gigabyte Aorus K1 keyboard, which uses Cherry MX switches, i.e. a really conventional desktop keyboard. Different pitch, different travel, different level of noise. That is what I think of when you say mechanical keyboard. This is something different. This keyboard is good. If they change the layout slightly, it would be even better, but it's really good. The keyboard has per key RGB lighting, which is a feature that continues to mystify me. Keyboards with white or yellow backlights so you can type in the dark, I'm fine with. Anything else is just glitzen for show. How can you possibly type on a keyboard with an RGB marquee? This pattern's actually called flow. But regardless, to my mind, it looks pretty, but it's unusable. If RGB is your thing, you dive into the Aorus Control Center and you've got a whole host of options. It works well, it looks pretty. I'm just not interested. That's covered the outside of the laptop. So how does it perform? The CPU is an Intel Core i7-10875H, which is just as clear as mud. With the 14nm processors from Intel these days, I've pretty much lost interest whether it's an 8th, 9th, 10th or whatever gen processor. It just seems to me irrelevant. The point here is 8 cores and 16 threads. A quick run of Cinebench R15 will tell us how it performs. The score beats the previous era of 15, but 8 cores versus 6 of course it does. However, beaten comfortably by AMD Ryzen 4900, which is 8 faster cores. In balanced power mode, this 45 watt CPU has PL1 set to 52 watts and PL2 to 80 watts. In Cinebench R20, the CPU ran at 3.2 GHz on all cores and was drawing 52 watts. In the single core test, Cinebench R20, that single core drew 32 watts and ran at 4.9 GHz. While we may consider Intel CPUs to be somewhat old and crusty, there's no denying this Core i7's doing a decent job. It's storming along. As you can see in our charts, CPU performance is pretty good. Intel cannot quite compete with AMD. Yes, it still feels funny to say that, but that's the fact of the matter. However, right now, just try buying an AMD 8-core laptop. You're going to struggle. This Gigabyte Aorus 15G is at the moment a mainstream laptop that you can actually buy, so the performance matters. Turning to the graphics side of things, we have Nvidia RTX 2070 Super, which is obviously a minor improvement over the previous RTX 2070. Nonetheless, Super, nothing to dislike there. This is a relatively chunky chassis, not huge, but certainly not thin and light. It can accommodate decent graphics and a decent processor and keep the whole shooting match cool. Again, harking back to those AMD laptops, the thin and lights, they tend to have RTX 2060 inside, which is perfectly decent, no problem with RTX 2060. But RTX 2070 Super, that delivers some stomp. The gaming performance of this laptop is impressive to behold. The battery life in our PC Mark 8 benchmark is almost exactly 5 hours. You can double that figure for a real world life, which means 10 hours. That's all day. That's good. It's a big battery in this laptop, but you're getting the results you want from it, so we're happy with that. Before I wrap things up, let's talk about the AI widget. This is a feature that Gigabyte demoed at CES 2019. The explanation didn't make a great deal of sense to me at the time, and you may recall that Linus excoriated it in a video after that, calling it something like the worst tech demo he's ever seen in his life. And I understand why, because it really was, here's this feature, we're not going to really give you any details about what it does, and it gives you more FPS, and it was like, What the heck does that mean? We were told by Gigabyte to benchmark the laptop so that it's simply working without communicating back and forth with the Azure servers, which are wherever the heck they're on the planet, and we'd see a benefit. And the difference is next to nothing. To wrap things up, the Aorus 15G in the UK is listed at £2,200, but you can find it on sale a penny under £2,000. And that strikes me as entirely reasonable. Every aspect of the laptop, with the possible exceptions of the AR widget and the layout of the keyboard, move those functions inboard, shift the numpad outboard, give us a bit of separation between numpad and all the rest of the keys. Apart from that, I'm happy with pretty much every single thing. If it was a tad thinner and a tad lighter, I wouldn't be upset, but you know that would hurt thermals, you know it would make it noisier, you know this is a compromise, and it's a good compromise. It does pretty much everything I want at a reasonable price. Well done, Gigabyte.